All right. The crowd is dwindling. Where is everybody? Is it because of tomorrow's celebration? I wonder if there's people that are trying to prep for that. Right? Tomorrow's Thursday. Celebration of student research and creative works. So there's probably people scrambling to get that all taken care of. Don't forget about this assignment, please. This is for points, not extra credit. So it's a video, TED Talk video, and then I've set up questions for you to answer based on that. So I think it's pretty easy to accomplish, but you do have to work through the video while you have this open so that you can work through it successfully. So I think a handful of you have done it already, but there's a lot more that still need to do that. So don't forget, please, let's do Sunday, 9 p.m. I don't like to make things due at midnight because you should be sleeping by then. So that's why I don't do that. Incredibly important. Your sleep is incredibly important. Although I know that's a coveted thing right now that you probably aren't getting much of. So we were looking at this last time. Prebiotic food, we've talked about probiotics, prebiotics now. You can certainly get those through a diverse diet. And then if you either ingest a lot of fermented food, that's a good source of probiotics, or if you take a supplement, and then you can even get supplements of prebiotics, then taken together. If you combine them, they're called symbiotics. They've looked at it. We looked at this last time that they're actually looking at, can we decrease COVID outbreaks and the length of the symptoms by altering the microbiome through prebiotic or probiotic. In this case, it was prebiotic. And so they're looking at that. So that brings up the idea of what is fiber, because it's a really big umbrella term, essentially. And the way they define it really is they look at, so this is kind of how they classify it, I guess, if you want to think of it that way. You either have insoluble fiber or soluble. Insoluble usually means that it's more for bulking up the contents of your intestinal tract. Is non-fermentable. Although it's slightly fermentable. Some microbes in your gut can do this, but it's basically non-fermentable. And then you have the soluble dietary fiber that is fermentable by the microbes that hang out with you. And then they look at, is it viscous or is it non-viscous? And so that's the last dichotomy here. And so you can see some examples here of the different kinds. So we're really kind of looking at those are tan boxes. We're looking at those ideas for the microbiome being able to access these types of fibers and then ferment them. And in most cases, through fermentation processes, of course, they're doing it to get their ATP needs met, but they produce different products. A lot of those products are the short chain fatty acids like butyrate or propionate or acetate. So basically, you might have heard, eat the rainbow, and that's definitely true, because that way you get a good mix of fibers that your microbes will be able to work with quite nicely. I was trying to find a picture that had fungi in it too, but I couldn't. Nowhere in here can I see any fungi, so I put a separate picture. Don't forget about fungi. They actually have a fair dose of beta glycans, which are a really good source of fiber. So make sure that you're doing that if you can. And then really looking at the packaging, they kind of they'll use two phrases. They'll say, oh, this is high in fiber, or they'll say source of fiber. It means two distinct things in terms of how much. So if it's at least 6 grams per 100 grams of that food, they're allowed to call it high in fiber. If it's not, then they have to say it's source of fiber if it's at least 3 grams. So be careful about that. You want high in fiber. is what you're going for. So a lot of the recommendations, the food pyramid and all of that, they'll say 25 to 30 grams. But here from this published paper, which was published a few years ago, they were looking at dietary fiber impact. And I thought this was interesting. They said studies performed on animal, like mouse models, usually have more dramatic effects, but also use higher amounts of fibers compared to levels used in human clinical trials, especially for prebiotics, whose dose is often 40-fold higher on a body weight basis. Okay, so that means when they're running these studies in mice, they give the mice way more fiber than if they do a similar study with humans as the model. In fact, the dose of dietary fiber used in animal studies more closely resembles the estimated amount of fiber consumed by our ancestors, greater than 100 grams per day. So I don't know anyone personally that has a diet that's close to 100 grams of fiber per day. But that's what our ancestors used to do when they had to, before agriculture, when they had to hunt and gather and eat what's available. So the authors of this study are saying that the fiber that's given is still far below the fiber amounts ingested back when humans first started to evolve. And then this continues on where they go into, if you switch diets, the South African and rural Ugandans are known to be largely free from chronic inflammatory diseases. And if you up the fiber intake, you can reverse risk factors for colorectal cancer. So they're saying your diet can definitely, if you improve your diet, you can improve your outcome. Therefore, it's possible that dietary fiber supplementation done in normal, like where they put too low of fiber intake into this experimental design, they say maybe it's just too low and physiologically irrelevant. So these scientists are saying we need to do more human clinical trials where we up the dose of fiber. They think it's not enough, and that's why we're seeing some conflicting results. And so I thought that was worth considering, that maybe the way the the experimental design was structured, it just didn't provide enough fiber. So keep that in mind too when you read any papers or look at study results on that. So a while back, I asked you all, I said, how much fiber do you think you get? These are the results from that question as a class. And so you can see that greater than 30 is the light blue, so 8.7% of you said that. Less than 10, which is the lowest, again, 8.7 said less than 10. And then see the breakdown in between those two extremes. So if you are one of those that is greater than 30 grams, gold star, and maybe pushing it even higher. Closer to 50 would be appropriate if that's acceptable for your body and you don't have pre-existing conditions where your doctor has advised against it. So I know sometimes people with IBS or Crohn's, they have to be very careful with their diet. And so you have to do that in conjunction with your doctor. So eat your fiber. Eat your fiber. So really, the more and more I've read a lot of published studies. I've read some textbooks on the microbiome. This is like one of the huge takeaways. If you eat a good mix of fiber in high enough quantities, you're going to really do quite a bit of preventative medicine for yourself. So another jargon word that they've created is postbiotics. So you will probably see this more and more. It's becoming a hot topic. But basically, we've already been talking about postbiotics. When we talk about short chain fatty acids, those are postbiotics. So when you see the word postbiotic on anything, what they're looking at is what is the microbe making and excreting? Or so chemicals produced by the microbes and excreted just from them taking the foods that you're feeding and then they act on it. And also chemicals released when the microbes in you die and break open. Of course, that's going to spill out a bunch of different chemicals that then your body has access to. So those are postbiotics. And definitely, so much of what we've been talking about are postbiotics. What are the microbes making and excreting that can impact us? And they know, especially the short chain fatty acids have received a lot of attention on that. So you're going to see this term showing up because now people are capitalizing on this. There's some businesses that have sprung up where they're looking at, manufacturing postbiotics that you can take, very similar to the probiotic idea, where you can get a mixture of microbes in a pill. They're thinking the same thing with postbiotics. Can we create a pill of postbiotics that could be useful? So I think I've already seen something out there. I can't remember what company, but they're selling butyrate pills. And so butyrate is one of the short chain fatty acids. So you're going to see more and more of that. Then I saw this and we've been chatting with the company about this idea. So now they're getting into the skincare company, which is, I'm sure, $1 billion industry. They're getting into this too, and they're saying, we could create skincare, whether it be lotion or face wash or body wash that has probiotics in it. And so this is a really new field of study. There hasn't been a ton done on the skin microbiome, if they can influence the skin microbiome through products such as this. And one thing I want to caution you on is if you want to try it, you need to really be careful of how they phrase things on the packaging, because here they put the word probiotic. So if there's probiotics in this, there's living organisms, right? But if you look at the ingredient list, nowhere in there is there live active cultures. Usually when you look at yogurt that has probiotics in it, it'll say live active cultures. There's nothing in here. If you look, the only thing that's in here where a microbe is mentioned is Saccharomyces, right here, Saccharomyces ferment. That's not live active cultures. That's postbiotics. So what they did is they allowed Saccharomyces, which is a yeast, to grow in a black tea xylem mixture, let it grow for a while, and then they took the ferment from that, essentially the whatever it excreted out, and added it in. And then further down, lactobacillus ferment. Again, it's not necessarily active cultures, it's the ferment. So just be careful about that. And in actuality, I would be shocked if lotion had living microbes in it. Because where do you find, like this is a face moisturizer. When you go to buy face moisturizer, where do you go in the grocery store? Go to the normal shelf, right? You don't go to a refrigerated portion to go get it. So they're just on the shelf with no refrigeration. You can't keep probiotics going like that on a shelf at room temp. That's not going to work. And so that's a huge stumbling block for the skincare industry, to put living cultures in there and then keep it at room temp and have it not spoil or get weird. They haven't figured out how to do that yet. Be careful. And then this, I thought this was clever. These two lower pictures go together. Phyla, acne phage system. So this is actually a pretty cool idea. They're using bacteriophages, they're claiming, in the serum or whatever it is. And that if you put that on your face where you have acne, the phages will attack the bacteria that are causing acne and get rid of the bacteria. So that's not a bad idea. That's actually credible. That I would believe could have some impact over, although maybe the ferment can do something, but whether or not, it's not live active cultures. That's what really kind of uh, was exasperating to read. But the phage system idea, did you notice they didn't put virus on there? I think that would turn some people off. Virus, but phage, you're kind of camouflaging what's really going on here, but you all know that a phage is a virus. So I don't know. I have not read much on this in terms of user feedback. So I don't know, but if you're interested, you could definitely search for that and see. So these postbiotics, they're really starting to look at it more carefully in the food industry, pharmaceutical industry. So you're going to probably see more about this in the next few years. They're really zooming in on short chain fatty acids and creating supplements or some kind of products that have that. But they're looking at all of it, prebiotics, probiotics, the whole deal. So it's becoming a thing. This was just published a couple years ago. And the production technologies is what's really kind of, and the shelf life. You have to give a lot of thought into, how are you going to store that product and whether or not the ingredients in that product can handle that kind of storage. So there's a lot left to go, but they'll figure some of it out, I'm sure. And then this is a really new field too, relatively speaking, where this was published a couple of years ago, where they're looking at, you may know maybe some family members or some friends that are taking more serious medication, maybe for cancer, or maybe they have an immune issue, and it might work on one person, but not so well on another. And so now the light bulb has kind of gone off and they're like, well, I wonder if it's the microbiome making the difference, why this drug works so well in this person, but not so well in that person. And so they're really starting to look at that. Drugs can profoundly affect microbial gene expression, while on the other hand, microbiota can transform drugs, affecting their bioavailability, efficacy, and toxicity. That's a great quote, especially when you keep in mind this idea of bioavailability. So when you eat certain foods or take certain drugs, some of it could just pass through where your body doesn't really directly interact with it and you excrete it out. But if it becomes bioavailable, then that means it's interacting, it's getting taken into your cells, it's more intimately interacting. And so they're saying the microbes definitely can be impacted by some of these drugs that you take for certain diseases or situations, and they can actually alter those drugs so that they don't function the same way because of that alteration. And it can lead to, how effective it is. Could it turn it toxic? And so they're really looking at this idea more carefully, especially in the realm of cancer treatments. I've seen some more closer look at what is the microbiome doing in patients who are on like chemotherapy and things like that. How is the microbiome affecting that? So this was published just a couple of years ago again, where they're looking at, what are the microbes doing to those drugs that patients have to take to try to deal with the disease that they're struggling with. So this is something to keep in mind. And, I certainly hope that none of you enter into a phase of your life where you have serious diseases to contend with, but you should definitely be keeping this in mind, or with loved ones, that, this is something you should be aware of and be kind of asking and pushing on your doctor to give you some feedback on this. Because you never know, there might be studies out there where they're saying, well, if you take this drug and if you take this probiotic, you have a better success rate. And that's what they're looking at. Can we do a more personalized medicine where if we figure out the drug isn't working as expected, we can supplement with certain key microbes that could then turn the tide and allow that drug to be more effective for that particular person. So complex interactions for sure. A few of the studies I read, it's like, oh boy, depending on what drug is being examined. You got all kinds of interactions going on with the microbe. So there's a lot to consider. There's not a whole lot known about it yet. They have a long way to go in terms of the research, but Nature Communications, which is a big journal, is looking at this with regard to cancer.
When people talk about xenobiotics, what completely mean?
So xenobiotics, all the jargon, I tell you. So xenobiotics are foreign. Xeno means foreign. What they're trying to imply is it's foreign to your microbes. Now, your microbes have never seen that drug before. You know, in their natural world, they just don't see it. And so it's foreign to them. So xenobiotics is what they're, that xeno phrase portion of the word is foreign. So they've been probably the most research that's been done is looking at cancer treatments. And like this was a big breakthrough where you had a large interdisciplinary cohort of scientists, and they are finding that in a particular cocktail of 11 different strains that they researched were able to really help in this case, it's skin cancer they were looking at. And so they know that there are some microbes that seem to really help patients with cancer. And so this idea of if you're on a drug, could you take these, this cocktail in combination with it to help, increase your chances of having a successful outcome. But they're really, cancer is still just such a puzzling set of diseases that I think it makes a lot of sense that the microbiome is influencing what's going on in the patient. And so they're really looking at this because they know microbes can influence the immune system, just, healthy patients. So they're saying, we really do need to look at this, especially with if there's drugs getting taken, we need to be really thoughtful about this. And like this last paper on the bottom here is looking at the influence of the gut microbiome on cancer treatment. So they're saying, certain chemotherapy treatments, the microbes present in that patient could really be influencing how well that chemotherapy is going to work. And, there's a lot of, unfortunately, when, at least historically, there's not a lot of training in medical schools for nutrition, like how food impacts you health-wise. They don't really, I think it's getting better, but like the current cohort of doctors that have been in practice for a while, they maybe got 2 weeks of nutrition information their whole 4 years of medical school. So they don't know from that kind of training, they just don't have the background and the knowledge. And I'm sure that they don't talk too much about the microbiome yet either in medical schools. So I think now that you've had this information, moving forward into your life, you can keep this in mind and be your own advocate. And you're going to have to do some of your own research because the medical professionals out there right now just don't have that knowledge. They don't have that background. So, I mean, I think this makes pretty good sense based on what we've been, examining and looking at in terms of how the microbes influence you and how you influence them by what you eat. Certainly, you're going to be kind of tipping the scale one way or the other in terms of your health based on what you eat. And they were looking at the Western diet, which they actually, some people call it the SAD diet, which stands for Standard American Diet. I like how that acronym goes down to SAD because it is sad. So the Western or the SAD diet. And so they're looking at, if you take high protein, animal protein, and high, especially animal fat intake, red meats, processed meat, colon, they were looking at colorectal cancer. And again, butyrate was a shining star in helping with feeding your intestinal cells, and it is a much more favorable situation. They looked at fiber. And so again, coming down to this idea of increased abundance of fiber, preventing colorectal cancer. So when I say eat your fiber, it's not just for your microbiome, it's also for you as a human as well.
Yes.
You think like a high fat intake of like unsaturated versus saturated fat?
Yeah, a lot of the meat fat is saturated fat, which is considered less healthy. Unsaturated fats typically come from plant sources, although fish can have a fair bit. So it's usually red meat that's high in saturated. Fish can have some unsaturated, but usually the unsaturated is healthier. And that's usually you get through plant-based diet. So yeah, the type of fat definitely makes a difference. And then I'm not going to get into it, but they're finding certain microbes that trigger too much bile acid production can be problematic. So there's lots that's going into this. Yes. Carnivore diet, vaguely.
Like high fat.
Yeah, I know.
Red meat.
Ew.
I don't know what you're trying to do, like what's the benefit of
I don't know. I think there's been some misconceptions, like maybe they think that's what our ancestors did, but not really. I mean, yeah, we ate meat as hunter and gatherers, but very infrequently because catching and killing something and then eating it was very hard. You know, we didn't have guns back then. So it's like you had to run and, you know, just the whole idea of chasing something down and killing it. It was very sporadic when you had meat to eat. The rest of the time it was plants and fruits and vegetables. And so I don't know if they are trying to market it as that's how our ancestors ate, but that's not how we ate back then. No. No, no, no. So, I don't know if you've heard about the hygiene hypothesis, that like if you keep your living area too clean, it can lead to, especially immune system issues like allergies and asthma. They are kind of doing away with the hygiene hypothesis term, and now they're saying, ah, oh boy, it just went out of my head. Hygiene hypothesis, old friends. Now they're calling it the old friends hypothesis, where we have coexisted with certain microbes over thousands of years as the human species, but we're losing them because we're too clean. That's where the hygiene idea comes into. And they're looking at this with the COVID pandemic. I started wondering about this like the day after they told us we're going into quarantine. This was running through my head. Uh-oh, because now when we were in quarantine back in 2020, you weren't interacting with a bunch of different people, going out to different areas. You weren't getting that exposure. And you need that diverse exposure of microbes. And of course, it was very scary back then. I understand the idea of going into quarantine for a while, but it has some serious implications for the ability of your immune system to function optimally, because it's not getting challenged by the microbes it should be, just by going out and living your life and interacting. So I was really surprised and happy to see this, that they're thinking about this and that we need to really consider this. It's a definitely a delicate balancing act because, pandemics are a serious thing, but so I guess from my perspective, one thing that I did when we were in quarantine, and if we ever, hopefully never, but if we ever have another situation like this, my advice to you would be at least go out into nature and get the microbes from there, if not from just commingling with other people. At least get out into nature as much as you can. It's okay to have dirt dragged into your house. There's plenty of good microbes.
Do you think that's an often provides?
Yes. I could see the correlation there, especially with babies being born right during this time. I could see where if you follow that cohort out over time, I would predict higher allergies. I'm sure someone's doing that study. I just haven't seen it yet. So just be aware of that. And then I really loved this idea here. I don't know if anyone's heard about this either. Microbiome first medicine.
It's becoming a more talked about subject, at least among medical microbiologists, where they're saying, we can't just look at the human. When you go to the doctor and you say, this is what's wrong with me and blah, 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 you can't just look at the human physiology and anatomy, you have to consider the microbiome. So you have to consider the superorganism, the microbes that coexist with you long-term, and the human body and physiology as well. And so this is a paper trying to say, we need to do this, moving forward, we need to do this. And medical doctors should be trained to do this. So this is yet to happen, but I think it's a great idea. And the only cases where I've seen doctors really aware of the microbiome is if I go to someone who has a DO degree rather than an MD. So you can get like a medical doctor, an MD degree, and then there's the DO degree, Doctor of Osteopathic Medicine, I think is the full thing. But people trained in DO school at least get a little bit of this microbiome idea. But I don't think there's much of that going on in medical school yet. So when I took my son who was having gut problems to the doctor, an MD doctor who just does general practice, and I said, I want his microbiome analyzed because I think there's something going on there, and that's why he's having so many gut issues. And the doctor just looked at me and said, what's a microbiome? I mean, he had no idea, and this wasn't that long ago. And so then I went to a DO and he's like, oh yeah, we'll do a microbiome analysis and we'll figure out inflammation. He tested for inflammation triggers and or markers, inflammation markers in his blood. And I mean, just went all at it and it worked. I mean, they found key things wrong. He had inflammation, he had an imbalance of microbes, and there were certain microbes in there that you really didn't want there in high amounts. And as soon as we got that fixed, he got 100% better. So, which brings me to the idea of if things get really drastic, they're looking at fecal transplants. And that actually has already been done in drastic cases to help someone survive an illness. The case study I read was with Clostridium difficile, which has been renamed, I think. But anyway, C. diff is the nickname for it. C. diff can kill you if it's a perfect storm. Kill you. There was a case study of a woman, you know how she got C. diff? She went to the grocery store, she bought a package, those tubular packages of like sugar cookie dough or something. I think it was chocolate chip cookie dough that she picked. And instead of baking it, she just unwrapped it and ate it. So she ate the raw dough, which I think you all know by now you're not supposed to do. She got a C. diff infection from that. And not directly, C. diff wasn't in the cookie dough. What happened was there's some other microbes in there because it was raw. She ate it, she got sick. They gave her antibiotics that wiped out, it was a broad spectrum, so it wiped out so much of her good microbes, but C. diff was in her body lurking there, and C. diff was resistant to it. So then C. diff overpopulated her body. She got really, really sick. Then they tried all these different antibiotics and C. diff was resistant. And they're like, we don't know what else to do. She was on her deathbed. And then one doctor said, let's do a fecal transplant. So they took the husband's feces and did some of this kind of stuff and gave it to her. And she, within under 48 hours, she was like almost 100% better, almost back to normal. And that's really an amazing case study. I mean, that was very obvious how powerful that can be. I was talking to a veterinarian about this, and she's like, well, yeah, veterinarians have done this for probably centuries, in the sense that if there were farm animals that were sick, they'd take feces from a healthier one, and they usually did what is that, oral gavage, where they just kind of make you swallow it down and the animal's fine. And so apparently, the veterinarians knew about this for quite some time, and medical doctors used to do it like centuries ago, and then it got out of favor, of course, because it's not very pleasant to think about, right? And back then they didn't have great procedures for it. Now they're coming up with fancier procedures where you don't have to swallow or get force-fed feces like the poor farm animals. And so there are protocols out there that they're developing where there's companies now. There's one that's in Minnesota that's looking at using fecal transplant to combat C. diff. Because that's such a problem. C. diff is very, very common in hospital environments. And so you can go into the hospital because you're sick with something and end up with a C. diff infection that could be super serious. And so this is a big thing. So anyways, they're looking at fecal transplant if patients are not responding to medicines, certain key things are going on, they've taken too many antibiotics. Could they get a better outcome through fecal transplants? So this is something that they're looking at. You can see in this graphic that they're looking at all kinds of options here in terms of what might be wrong with the patient and how they could be helped through fecal transplant. What do you think? Would you opt for that? I sure would. If it was going to save my life. You become less fixated on feces once you have children. So many diapers you change over that stretch of time. It's like, yeah, no big deal. So you might even be a super donor. Did you know you can earn money by, you don't even like donate your feces. You get paid for giving your feces to some of these companies. I just checked one of the websites and right now they're saying, well, we're no longer accepting any feces. So they're like maxed out, but I'm sure they'll open that up again where you could be actually getting paid. So they call it the super donor. Super donor is what they're looking for. They're looking for people who have really good feces that have all the key, things that they're looking for that particular application. And so they're starting to like try to figure this out through these businesses with all these feces being coming in from different people. They're looking at, is there a super donor out there that we could point to, or maybe, super donors for different situations. And so they're looking at it. Who knows? It might be something where you could earn a little bit of side cash when they do another call for, hey, we need more feces. So look into it. It's kind of like it'd be easier than donating blood, right? If you're afraid of needles, a lot simpler than that idea. So, and if you want to spend some bucks, you can get a feel for your own microbiome. I found this on Amazon. So even companies like that are offering, this one wasn't too expensive. The one that I did with my son was actually more than this. It was through a medical, it was actually a scientific company. We use a lot of their products here in our department. So I recognize, I'm blanking on the name, but it was a very reputable company that was being used for my son's diagnostic kit. But anyways, you can buy one, $180 when I looked at this one. And then this one, another one, these are both on Amazon. So and I know they're developing more of these types of kits out there where you can test your own microbiome through fecal analysis. So lots and lots of research still to be done, but what they have accomplished is pretty amazing and actually very exciting. There's a lot of potential there, and you have a lot more control over your health than we ever imagined. And so it's really hopeful for me to see this area of research expanding, because I think it puts a lot of control on our health in our own hands. So I think it's a great idea. Well, anyways, I was looking for some specific images for these slide sets, and I found some interesting other things that you can get that are microbial based besides a microbiome kit. I was surprised how much is out there for sale where they're really playing up microbes. That's kind of a new thing. Most people are so scared of microbes or just don't have the knowledge but anyways, so there's all kinds of t-shirts with cute little sayings. And they even have my college career included alcohol, streaking, and antibiotics. This is soap that you can put in your bathroom, in your guest bathroom, and freak out your guests. Keychains, plant pots. Socks, scarves. These are coasters, like neoprene coasters you can put your beer on. I need to give this out to my one sister-in-law. I love her dearly, but she's deathly afraid of microbes, so it's tempting to get her a gag Christmas gift. Oh, and those are gold earrings. These are fancy gold earrings. That's a street plate. For the 4-quadrant street plate with diamonds for the isolated colonies. Pretty fancy. So yeah, there's all kinds of things out there now being marketed for people who geek out about microbes. I was really quite pleasantly surprised. Etsy, I think, has a lot of that stuff if you want to get lost on Etsy's webpage. Okay. That's all I have time for. I could go on, but that's all I have time for with the human microbiome. So we are behind in schedule. However, I did want to get into a shorter version of the food microbiology because that is another topic that you can use for the rest of your life. And it's not something that just is, done when you finish with this class. So I would like to get into that because I think it would be very beneficial for you. You kind of got at it a little bit. Remember that lab experiment that you did where you had the placemats? So we're kind of thinking about this idea, like how do you live your life when you go to interact with food? How do you prepare food? And how do the microbes play a role in what's going on with that? So it's in EduCat. It's posted under food microbiology. So I'm going to skip the first few slides are looking at a book over in the library, actually, and some of the quotes from the book that I think are super on point in terms of when you eat, that's the most intimate exposure you'll have with your environment. And so I put that in there for you to read. It's very well phrased. I think he did an excellent job with that. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. So I wanted to make sure you understood there's a couple of terms. This idea of spoilage and contamination. So if you say the food is spoiled, what you're saying is microbes have been there doing their stuff and it's made the food distasteful enough that you don't want to eat it. It's spoiled. It's going to get thrown away. That doesn't mean you get sick from this. It just doesn't taste good. And so if you've ever had, butter going bad, that rancid nastiness, or I'm sure a lot of you have tasted milk that's gone bad. Food contamination or food poisoning means there's human pathogens lurking that could get you sick. All right, so those are two different concepts, really, both involving microbes, but still. And so there's some tables in here of food spoilage ideas. And this is more just for your own education. I'm not really going to get into the details on this on the final exam. But if you've ever wondered, like, why is the milk all coagulated after sitting in my fridge, and so this will tell you what's been going on to cause these types of spoilage going on. So this is more just for you to, like, I smell sulfur coming from eggs. I definitely smell that. And most of this, probably a lot of you have experienced at one point or another through your life to date. And so it's kind of just interesting to read through what might be going on here. And it's a little hard to tell the way that these two tables are displayed, but there are both bacteria and fungi that are dealing with this. This particular table is a little bit more like, okay, yeah, bacteria and fungi. So they have a separate column here saying, don't forget about the fungi. There's plenty of fungi that can also cause issues. And here it's vegetables, meat, eggs, milk, high sugar foods. But don't forget about the fungi. They can also cause problems. So this next slide, I would like you to know though. So this is the idea that, when you are storing your food, you have to think about the moisture content of the food, and that will dictate your thoughts on how long can I keep this food around before I should either eat it or throw it away. So when they label food as perishable, that means there's a lot of water or a fair dose of water still in that product when you go to buy it. And remember, all living things need water, including microbes. And so if microbes are denied water, they're either going to die or go dormant and won't be a problem. However, there's plenty of foods out there that have a pretty high water content. They actually can measure water content of different foods, and they base it on this idea called water activity, base of W. And so they can generate water activity values for all kinds of different foods that are sold. They set the standard as pure water is equal to 1 for water activity, and then everything else is under that. So it's a range essentially from 0 to 1. And so salted fish, on the other hand, has a water activity below pure water, of course, going to be 0.75. So salted fish, I always wondered when my mom would take me and we'd go buy fish and it was always salted. I'm like, why are they salting fish? We can salt our own fish. But really, if you put salt on the fish carcass, you're essentially creating a situation where microbes don't have access to free water. It's this idea of osmosis situation where you actually can suck water out of the microbe with such a salty environment that the microbe is now exposed to. It's like, there's salt all around me. And so that actually can suck water out of the microbe and dehydrate and kill the microbe. So it's an effective strategy that's been around for centuries. Chocolate, honey, milk, dried milk has even lower water activity. So that's something, you can kind of keep in mind and then these are the 3 categories: perishable, semi, and non-perishable when you go to look at the different products that are for sale, different food products. So that's why you can leave, flour on your shelf for years, but you can't really for the fish or the meat. It's a lot has to do with the water content of the food. So keep that in mind. Then also keep in mind, so I just got, we spent 2 weeks talking about the human microbiome and that we are, coexisting with trillions of microbes in and on us. Don't forget, even if if you say, well, I don't eat meat, blah, blah, blah. Well, you still are getting access to microbes that hang out with other organisms. So even plants have their own microbiome. They have all kinds of microbes on them, in them, just like, well, not just like us, because they're a different body system, but here they're trying to show a graphic where you can see microbes everywhere on the plant and in the plant. And so when you eat these plants, you potentially are getting these microbes too in your body. And that has been a little bit of a light bulb for a lot of people who study food transfer of pathogens through food, because now they're like, oh, well, what about human pathogens that attack us, like E. coli or Bacillus cereus? Can it hang out with plants? And then if we eat the plant, can it cause us problems? So this is an emerging field of study looking at, could human pathogens get into a field of plants and then cause issues? And if you go to the Center for Disease Control website, the answer is absolutely yes. You can get transfer of E. coli from, hanging out on lettuce that you then ingest and eat, or cauliflower. And there was cantaloupe, another one. I mean, the list goes on and on. You can see all kinds of case studies on their website. But even the natural microbes that hang out with plants, they're still living when you ingest them. Especially if you do raw leafy greens or something like that, you are getting their microbiome too. Whether they'll persist in you is another matter, but just don't forget that they're there. And then the concern is, what can human pathogens do if manure gets applied, and cow manure is commonly used to put on the field, and very often human pathogens are lurking in the manure that can cause us problems. So you can see it could get transferred into the plant world, and then you eat the plants. So this is a Petri plate where they took a leaf and pressed it down and then incubated. You can see that the leaf is well colonized. This is a stomata or a pore on the leaf surface where you can see the size difference. There's a bunch of microbes entering into the pore of the plant. So inside the leaf tissue, they'll get in. And we know that seeds are well colonized inside the seed as well as on the surface of the seed with microbes. And so this is, the plant microbiome, and you can get transfer of microbes to you when you eat those. What they're doing exactly, we don't have a ton on that, but whether you eat the plant itself or some of the seeds that you might eat. Through the whole life of the plant, they are colonized with microbes at the different stages of their life. And then, of course, we eat the plants. So we know that plants can recruit, so to speak, their own suite of microbes. These different bar graphs or pie charts are showing this idea that depending on what part of the plant body you're looking at, you have different microbes. They select for smaller mixtures, like in the soil, you get a ton of different microbes, but then the plant will influence who they associate with. So that's why you see the shift in the pie chart, where apparently this plant likes the blue, which I guess is proteobacteria. You see more of that. So there's all this dynamic going on as well. Yes,
Do raw foods have more microbes than pasteurized?
yes, definitely.
It's
Don't know. I mean, as far as I can tell, the story's out, except for like, I know raw milk is a thing. A lot of people swear by it. I would be cautious about that. Like if you were to really go for raw milk, I would want to know the farmer and know how the cows are being treated and go visit their place. Like I wouldn't just grab some raw milk from somebody that I didn't know, you know? So I think there's you have to give a lot of thought into raw foods. So we'll talk a little bit more about that, but we're over time. Thank you for your patience. We'll continue this on Friday.